I thought I was just becoming an arrogant jerk. That was my very first thought. It was the only explanation that seemed to fit the facts. I had spent all this time trying to heal. I had spent years actively trying to understand myself, trying to dismantle my own conditioning, trying to become more conscious. I had stepped away from a 12-year career in hospice care because I was drowning in other people's pain, and I was finally trying to build some boundaries. I thought the reward for all that inner work, all that painful, grueling self-reflection, would be a profound sense of peace. I thought I was supposed to become an ocean of tolerance, a saint of patience. I thought that the more you understood human nature, the more you would naturally just love everyone unconditionally. Instead, my reward was that I suddenly could not stand being in the same room with people I used to tolerate just fine. Everything everyone said irritated me, and I do not mean a mild annoyance. I mean a visceral, skin-crawling, jaw-clenching irritation. The surface-level conversations, the endless complaining about situations they absolutely refused to fix. The fake, polite social dynamics I used to endure just to keep the peace. Suddenly, it all felt physically draining. I felt this growing disgust with the fake interactions that seemed to make up 90% of adult life. I would sit at a coffee shop with an old friend, and as they talked about the exact same drama they'd been talking about for 5 years, I would feel this intense, overwhelming urge to just stand up and walk away. And then, right after the disgust, came the guilt. Because if you're supposed to be awakening, if you're supposed to be growing more conscious, why do you suddenly dislike half the people you know? Why does everything everyone says irritate you so much lately? Before we go any further into this, if this kind of messy, uncomfortable honesty resonates with you, if you are tired of the sanitized version of self-development, hitting subscribe tells the algorithm to send you more of these conversations. Because this channel exists for exactly this type of exploration. The things we rarely admit out loud. So there I was, sitting in my apartment in Asheville, looking out at the Blue Ridge Mountains, feeling like a complete fraud. I was 40-something years old. A guy who used to literally hold the hands of people as they took their last breaths. A guy who built his entire identity around being the ultimate empath. And now I could not even hold a conversation at a diner without wanting to scream. Let me give you a specific example of how bad it got. During my hospice years, I had a patient. I will call her Mrs. Higgins. She was in her final weeks and her family would come to visit, but they would not really visit her. They would sit in the corner of the room, complaining loudly about the hospital food, complaining about the drive, complaining about the traffic. They would talk over her as if she were already dead, and for years I would sit there and absorb it. I would nod empathetically. I would offer them coffee. I told myself I was being a good person. I told myself that taking on their toxicity was my duty as a compassionate human being. I would drive home in total silence, feeling like my bones were made of lead, and I would call it empathy. But now, years later, after doing the psychological work to stop being a human sponge, that tolerance was completely gone. I sat down for coffee with an old acquaintance. Let's call him Mark. Mark spent 45 minutes complaining about his boss. Not a real problem, just the same passive-aggressive office politics he had been enduring and contributing to for a decade. In the past, I would have offered advice. I would have validated him. This time, my chest tightened. My jaw literally locked. The coffee tasted like ash in my mouth. I looked at Mark and I felt absolutely zero empathy. None. Just a suffocating, claustrophobic irritation. I felt this terrifying thought cross my mind. I thought, I do not care about your problems at all. Let me tell you another thing about those hospice years. When you are surrounded by death, you realize very quickly how much of life is spent maintaining completely useless social fictions. I would watch families argue about who was going to inherit a broken grandfather clock while their mother was in the next room taking her final breaths. I would watch people spend their last days refusing to forgive a sibling over an argument that happened 20 years ago. I absorbed all of that. I watched the absolute tragedy of the unlived life, of the unexamined life. And I promised myself I would never be like that. I promised myself I would do the work. I would be conscious. So when I finally left that job, when I finally started building my own life, I developed a massive superiority complex masked as spiritual awakening. I thought I had seen the ultimate truth of human existence, and therefore I was exempt from the messy, petty reality of everyday life. I thought I had graduated from humanity. I thought my empathy was broken. I thought I was becoming a sociopath. I seriously considered that I was just suffering from spiritual narcissism. You've probably heard the term. It is when you use your supposed growth to feel superior to everyone else, to look down from your enlightened little mountain at all the asleep people who just do not get it. And I did not want to be that guy. I hated that guy. So I tried to fix it, I really did. I tried to force myself back into those old social dynamics. I thought, if I am truly growing, I should not be bothered by anyone. True enlightenment means nothing disturbs your peace, alright? So I would go to the dinners, I would sit there and listen to someone complain for an hour about a problem they created, a problem they had zero intention of solving. I would try to do loving kindness meditation right there at the table. I would try to silently beam light and compassion at them while they complained about their neighbors. And I would leave those dinners feeling like I had swallowed broken glass. It was exhausting. It felt like I was acting in a play where I had forgotten my lines, but everyone else was just going on with the scene, completely oblivious to the fact that the script made no sense. Spiritual bypassing is just putting a band-aid on a bullet wound. It does not stop the bleeding. It just makes the wound fester in secret. I almost gave up trying to understand it. I was ready to just accept that maybe aging just makes you bitter. Maybe seeing too much grief during my hospice years had just permanently burned out my tolerance receptors. I was ready to isolate myself, to just stop trying to connect with people entirely. But I couldn't sleep one night. This was a few years ago. I was pacing around my living room, feeling that exact specific irritation burning in my chest after a particularly draining phone call with a family member. I pulled a book off my shelf. Carl Jung's Memories, Dreams, Reflections. It was the book that a therapist had handed to me during the absolute darkest part of my divorce. The book that kind of started this whole psychological unraveling for me. My ex-wife used to tell me I was too nice. But what she really meant was that I had zero boundaries, which meant I was essentially invisible. That divorce broke me open, and this book was the only thing that made sense of the pieces. I wasn't looking for an answer that night. I was just looking for a distraction, a way to quiet my mind so I could get a few hours of sleep. And then I read one sentence. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. I had read that sentence before, probably 3 or 4 times. It is one of his most famous quotes. You see it on inspirational posters. But this time, it landed differently. Wait, let me rephrase that. It didn't just land differently. It felt like a physical accusation. I closed the book. I actually got angry at the book. I thought, no, Carl. That is a nice poetic thought, but the reason I am irritated with these people is because they are being shallow. They are being fake. They refuse to take responsibility for their own lives. It has absolutely nothing to do with me. I am irritated because they are doing things wrong, except that I couldn't stop thinking about it. The anger I felt at that quote was a signal. When you react with that much defensiveness to a psychological concept, it usually means it has hit a nerve that you have spent a lot of energy trying to bury. So I started digging deeper. I went back to the texts. I opened Marie-Louise von Franz, her work on the shadow in fairy tales. And I started to realize something that I really did not want to realize. Von Franz points out that the shadow is not just a theoretical concept. It is a moral problem. It challenges the entire ego personality. It takes real, grueling moral effort to become conscious of these hidden traits instead of just projecting them onto others. In fairy tales, the shadow is often represented as the troll under the bridge. The dark, ugly thing that demands a toll before you can cross into the next phase of your life. You cannot just send love and light to the troll. You cannot just ignore the troll. You either have to pay the toll or you have to fight it. You have to engage with it. And then I read another perspective. Edward Edinger, in his book Ego and Archetype, he wrote about how a weak ego initially separates itself from the shadow just to feel good. It resists acknowledging the projection because it lacks the capacity to assimilate that dark material without feeling completely overwhelmed. A weak ego needs to believe it is purely good, so it throws everything else onto the people around it. And suddenly, sitting in the quiet of my apartment, the math started to make horrifying sense. Why was I so intensely irritated by people complaining and not fixing their problems? Because for 39 years of my life, I was the guy who complained about his lack of boundaries but never fixed them. I was the guy who let his marriage fall apart while silently playing the victim. I was the guy who absorbed everyone else's pain in the hospice ward. Like with Mrs. Higgins' family, because I was too afraid to confront my own emptiness, I hadn't broken my empathy. I was experiencing projection, but this was a very specific, agonizing kind of projection. I wasn't projecting my current flaws onto them. I was projecting the mask I had just managed to take off. Think about this. Stay with me here, because this is the part that changes everything. When you start to individuate, when you start to actually do the hard work of making the unconscious conscious. You discard certain survival mechanisms, you stop people pleasing, you stop pretending everything is fine when it is not. You stop tolerating the surface level interactions that keep everyone comfortable but dead inside. And the moment you drop that mask, the moment you decide you are no longer going to behave that way, it becomes your shadow. You have exiled it from your conscious identity. You have declared, I am no longer that person. So when you see someone else walking around wearing your old mask, when you see them doing the exact thing you just spent months or years agonizingly trying to stop doing, your ego reacts with violent rejection. It is like an ex-smoker. Have you ever noticed that the most militant, aggressive anti-smokers are always people who used to smoke 2 packs a day? They cannot stand the smell of smoke, not just because it is unhealthy, but because the desire to smoke is still sitting right there in their shadow. The addiction is still part of their psychological makeup, just repressed. So, they attack it in the external world. It is the exact same mechanism. It is like looking at a photograph of yourself from middle school, where you had a terrible haircut and an embarrassing outfit. You cringe. You want to hide it. You want to distance yourself from it as much as possible. You feel a physical revulsion. The irritation you feel toward them is not spiritual superiority. It is an allergic reaction to your own recently discarded self. Let's pause here for a second, because I really want you to understand the mechanics of this. It is so easy to gloss over the concept of projection. We hear the word all the time, but what is actually happening in your brain? Your ego is essentially a bouncer at the door of a very exclusive club. The club is your conscious identity. The club is who you think you are, and the bouncer's only job is to keep the club looking good. For decades, my bouncer let in the people pleaser. He let in the guy who had no boundaries. He let in the guy who smiled while people complained, because that guy was considered quote-unquote good. That was the identity. But when I started doing the work, when I started reading Jung and going to therapy, I fired that guy. I kicked the people pleaser out of the club. I said, you are no longer welcome here. You are destroying me. Now, the people pleaser didn't just disappear. Energy doesn't just vanish. He was cast out into the shadow. He was exiled. And the bouncer, my ego, is terrified that he might come back. The ego is terrified of regressing. So the bouncer becomes hyper-vigilant. He starts scanning the horizon for any sign of the people pleaser. And then I go to a dinner party, and I see someone else doing it. I see someone else sitting there, smiling tightly while their relative talks over them. I see someone else wearing the exact mask I just violently ripped off my own face. The bouncer sees it, and he panics. He sounds the alarm. He creates a massive, disproportionate emotional reaction of disgust and irritation. Why? To create distance. The irritation is the ego's way of screaming, that is not me anymore. Look how much I hate that. Look how disgusted I am by that behavior. I could not possibly be that person because look at how much it revolts me. It is a defense mechanism. It is a desperately insecure ego trying to convince itself that it has actually changed. If I was truly secure in my new boundaries, if I had actually integrated that part of myself, I would look at the person at the dinner party and feel compassion. I would think, man, I remember how exhausting it was to be trapped in that dynamic. But I didn't feel compassion. I felt rage. I felt irritation. Because the bouncer was still insecure. The ego was still weak. It needed an enemy to prove its own goodness. This changed everything for me. There is an old story about Ram Dass. He used to say that if you think you are enlightened, go spend a week with your parents. I always thought that was just a funny joke about family dynamics. But it is not a joke. It is a precise psychological diagnostic test. I remember trying to go home for Thanksgiving shortly after my divorce. I was deep into my Jungian reading. I had been doing the work. I thought I was very centered, very balanced. I drove the 4 hours to my family's house, listening to audiobooks, feeling like a completely new man. We sat down at the dinner table, and within 20 minutes, one of my relatives made the exact same passive-aggressive comment they had been making since I was 10 years old. A comment about my career choices. A comment designed to make themselves feel big by making me feel small. In the past, I would have swallowed it, I would have smiled. This time, the irritation was so intense I thought I was going to explode. I had to physically excuse myself. I locked myself in the childhood bathroom, staring at the terrible wallpaper, gripping the edge of the sink, realizing I was failing Ram Dass's test spectacularly. Because the people closest to us, the environments we grew up in, they are the perfect mirrors for our shadow. The true test of your consciousness does not happen in isolation. It does not happen when you are meditating alone in a silent room. It happens when you are sitting across from someone who is perfectly embodying the exact trait you just spent 2 years trying to exercise from your own personality. I thought I was becoming an arrogant jerk, but sitting there, at 2 in the morning, looking at Jung's words, I realized I had to face a much more uncomfortable truth. I lost something that night. I lost the comfort of being the victim of other people's shallowness. I lost the ability to just sit on my high horse and judge them for not doing the work. It is incredibly easy to be the victim. It requires absolutely nothing of you. It requires zero moral effort to look at the world and say, they are toxic and I am healed. Taking responsibility for the projection is excruciating, because it means admitting that the troll under the bridge is actually just you in a different outfit. I wanted it to be simple. I wanted the answer to be, yes, Garrett, you are growing and they are stagnant, and that is why it hurts. You are just operating on a higher frequency now. That is what the internet wants you to believe. That is what all the self-help blogs tell you. They tell you to just cut toxic people out of your life and protect your peace. But the truth was heavier and much more demanding. The irritation was a diagnostic tool. Every single time I felt that spike of annoyance, every time I felt that intense disgust at someone's fake interaction or endless complaining, it was a compass pointing directly at a part of myself I was still deeply afraid of. It was pointing at the parts of me that I had amputated to feel healed. Erich Neumann wrote about this in Depth Psychology and A New Ethic. He said that the goal of this psychological work is not perfection, it is wholeness. And wholeness means accepting the troll under the bridge. Wholeness means recognizing that the capacity for shallowness, the capacity for complaining, the capacity for people-pleasing, it is all still inside you. It never goes away. You just learn to manage it. You cannot be whole if you are caught in the destructive cycle of projecting your disowned traits onto a scapegoat. You cannot be whole if you are using your psychological growth as a weapon to sever yourself from humanity. It is a paradox. You do the work to become more yourself, and in doing so, you become alienated from the people you used to fit in with. But if you stop there, if you stay in that alienation and call it enlightenment, you have just built a new, shinier ego, a spiritually superior ego. But an ego nonetheless. You have to take the next step. You have to recognize the mirror. Remember when I said I thought I was becoming an arrogant jerk? I was right, but for the completely wrong reason. I wasn't arrogant because I felt irritated by them. The irritation was natural. It was an involuntary psychological reflex. The ego defending its new borders against the shadow it just expelled. I was arrogant for thinking I shouldn't feel it. I was arrogant for thinking I was somehow above the messy, clumsy, deeply human reaction of outgrowing a skin. I was arrogant for demanding that my growth look like a serene, peaceful painting, instead of a messy surgical procedure. I don't force myself to tolerate the surface-level nonsense anymore. If a conversation is draining, if a dynamic is based on complaining without action, I leave. I set the boundary. But the difference is, I don't set the boundary out of disgust anymore. I don't leave the room thinking, I am so much better than this. I leave the room thinking, I know exactly why they are doing that. I know how heavy that mask is, because I wore it for 40 years, and I am just so incredibly glad I don't have to wear it anymore. The irritation doesn't disappear completely, but it stops being a poison. It becomes a map. It shows you exactly what you have integrated and exactly what you are still running from. And that is a lonely realization. But it is also the only true way forward. If this journey made you rethink your own reactions, if it gave you a different lens to look through, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. I don't run sponsors here. I rely entirely on the people who actually find value in this deep dive to keep the lights on and keep these conversations happening. Every contribution goes directly into making the next video possible, and it reminds me that I am not just talking into the void. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you felt this sudden intolerance for people you used to be fine with? Tell me the specific behavior that triggers it the most in the comments. Let's see if we can trace the shadow together.